years ago, Carthagena was a thriving African-American community, a settlement of freed slaves seeking a better life. The settlement prospered for many years, but eventually prejudice forced them to move to bigger cities for better jobs. I'm Tara Carr.
And I'm Julie Wenning. Prejudice also forced another group of potential settlers, the Randolph slaves, to abandon their plans of settling in the Carthagena area and to move to other towns. Within this newscast, we will talk to several area historians about these people and their settlements.
Over a century ago, Augustus Wattles, with 20 ox carts and some 300 freed slaves, left Cincinnati for a better life in Carthagena. These people who were traveling with Wattles led a life that was no different than the life they led in slavery. In Cincinnati, they held jobs such as poorly paid cooks, maids, and farmhands.
While living in Cincinnati, Wattles opened a school for Negroes and taught there for 2 years. But realizing the emancipated slaves deserved a better life, they left for Carthagena, where Wattles had acquired approximately 20,000 acres of land to be divided among the settlers. Most of this land became farmland. However, Wattles took for himself 250 acres on which he built the manual labor school for colored youths. And on this land, he also built his cabin. In June of 1846, Wattles returned to Cincinnati to marry Susan E. Purley, and together they had 4 children, Sarah, Theodore, Irma, and Mary Ann. Both Sarah and Mary Ann later became doctors and married. Nothing is known of Theodore except for his birth date, May 25, 1840. Irma later married and had several children.
1837, Samuel Emlyn died, leaving $20,000 for the advancement in school learning, agriculture, mechanic trades, or arts of free, male, orphan children of African or Indian descent. 3 years later, Wattles learned of the $20,000 left by Emlyn. Because he could no longer support the school, in 1842 he sold the school to Emlyn's trustees, who in turn used the money to support it. Because of Emlyn's generous gift, the school was renamed the Emlyn Institute, and Wattles stayed on as superintendent.
In 1846, 3,200 acres near Wattles' settlement was purchased by Judge Lay, who was following the will of John Randolph of Roanoke, Virginia. Randolph, an abolitionist, wished for his slaves to be emancipated after his death. The now freed slaves, with their freedom papers, traveled by canal to what was rightfully their land, but when they docked their boats in New Bremen, they were met by a group of armed whites who forced the slaves back down the canal to Piqua, Troy, and other nearby towns. After the white people had ran the Randolph slaves out of what was legally their land, they thought they could do the same with the Wattles settlement. They threatened Wattles and pressured the other settlers to leave, which they did. Because of a shortage of students, Emlyn Institute was soon forced to close its facilities. Years later, in 1861, the land on which the institute stood was sold to the Roman Catholics. St. Charles Seminary now stands where this institute once stood. At St. Charles Seminary, we talked with Father Florian Harike, who grew up in Carthagena. He told us about his memories of living there.
Want me to recall all the happy memories I had. Carthagena was a little bigger town. We used to have streets and alleys that we could row through, and of course it was half white and half black, or Africans, whatever you. But to me, of course, they were real, honest to good neighbors. And we loved them. I played ball with them, and we had fun, though we did not go to school together until 1922. I was in the 8th grade, I guess, when they had a black school, and there used to be 2 black churches here, a Methodist and a Baptist. I don't remember the Methodist minister, but I remember when the preacher Lewis left town, there were not enough people here anymore to really support a minister. So he really and truly sold his white horse to my dad, bought the white horse that he had, and then he went to some city to work in the ministry there. And so occasionally there would be a visiting minister would come and they would have a service. They had their own school, they had their own black teacher. Is it right for me to use the word black?
Yeah, that's fine.
She was a very refined teacher. She had a good-sized school, and that was right back of the church that was up there on Harike Road. That's gone, the school's gone, and everything that served the young people, these Afro-Americans that lived here, and with whom we played ball and craft and sold our furs and so on. It was really a marvelous thing. And then all of a sudden, of course, manufacturing became a big deal, and jobs opened up, and the farms were a little too small that they had to produce a real good living. So for a better life, some moved to St. Mary's, some moved to Pickwick, some moved to Dayton, and I don't know where they all moved, but very quickly, of course. In 1922, the school, they joined our school, and we went to school together, and we played ball together, and everything went on as usual. It made no difference at all. So I enjoyed really, we enjoyed them too, because they had a real sense of humor. And we had no problems at all that I know of. It was so easy. I mean, there was no difficulty at all. I was sorry to see a lot of them go. We used to have a ball team that was black. We called it the Carthagena Mohawks. And they were pretty good ball players. Jesse Bowles and Chub Hurd, and these boys were real good ball players. Of course, I was a fan of theirs, because I used to go to the game and root for them when they would play Montezuma or Chickasaw or Cranberry. See, all these little towns had baseball teams at that time. And Carthagena then, very quickly, of course, they sold their land, and their houses were, of course, they were falling in, they weren't taken care of then as they moved out, and there weren't people to come in and take them over. To shoe horses and sharpen plowshares and grind sickles. In those days, they had to mow the hay, and they had to have a sickle in the binder and bind the wheat and the oats and the corn. If they were real good big farmers, they used to have a kind of a corn sled, and you'd have to sit there and grab so many hills of corn. Now they plant so much corn in one field, that in one row. It used to be just every so far three little stalks of corn would come up, and and I didn't, and my dad, of course, he had about 30 acres, because he had 8 children, and he had to feed them, and blacksmiths, they worked hard day or night, practically, but it was not a very profitable business, shoeing horses. He used to pull the shoes off and then reset them if they were good, because the horse's hoofs would grow and they'd have to be renewed. He'd have to trim the hoof and nail the shoe back on and put on new cleats or whatever so they could work. And most of the blacks around were farmers. Old Ellick Epps used to tell me, how he walked all the way to Celina. He was a real old man. And he said, well, I walked to Celina when they were building that reservoir there. And I worked all day, and then I would walk home at night. I used to carry my own lunch to work there. And they did a lot of logging, because there was a sawmill at Chickasaw that we called it the handle factory. And they made handles, and they would buzz lumber to build the homes for the people that bought homes or wanted to build a home. My uncle out here on close to Coldwater Road, had inherited a few acres of land, and he, it was 40 acres really of virgin forest, and he cut that down, and the house in which Alvin Harike still lives was built. The barn that he still uses for his horses, and he uses nothing but horses to do his farming, and this wagon shed that he has was built too with lumber that they made from the property that he inherited from Grandpa. And Dad inherited the blacksmith shop, and the other two children got cash. Partly it was farmland, and it wasn't good land. And old Miss John Meyer lived up there. He had a big family. His children were his youngest child was older than I am. And they lived up there, and then Stogler lived up there, but they took that down. That's all gone. And then Weber bought the land, and eventually, I think it was Weber, I think the jeweler in Celina, bought the land there, and they made a golf course eventually. I don't know when that started, because I went to the seminary in 1923.
So it was originally a dairy farm?
Well, a pasture, really. The dairy farm was over on Stelzer Road. That was down this way just a little ways, and then you turn left, and you go past the old barn. The people still hit the barn where some of the cattle were housed with their golf balls on hole 1, 2, 3, 4. Because I hit the barn myself already. So it's, and where did they move? Tom Hurd, I know, moved to Pickwick. My sister lives in Glenwood, and not too far from her, some of our old friends and neighbors live in St. Mary's, still live there, and she lives outside of St. Mary's in Glenwood.
After the Randolph slaves left, Plunkett, an agent of Judge Lay, sold their land to the newly arrived whites. In 1920 and again today, the descendants of the Randolph slaves are fighting to be reimbursed of up to $80,000 each for the land that was truly their ancestors. Shannon McFarlin, a writer for the Daily Standard in Celina, agreed to talk to us about these famous trials.
The interesting aspects of doing research on the town of Carthagena is that I discovered through talking to both black people and white people that grew up in Carthagena that the local legend about the amount of racism that existed in the Carthagena area was totally false. The black people and the white people that grew up in Carthagena together were friends, co-workers. One thing people also don't seem to understand is that blacks stayed in Carthagena for generations. There's some families that stayed there from one generation to the other as long as 100 years. The last black family that left there was in the 1960s. Blacks and whites, even to the extent after the last black family had left Carthagena altogether, they would still socialize with each other. The white people from Carthagena would still go to Lima for social functions with the black people that they knew that they were brought up with, and the black people still would come down to Carthagena and visit with the white people that they had known and grown up with there. And it did surprise me because I'd been brought up believing the same thing that everybody else in Mercer County had been brought up believing, that, oh, you know, the black people were feared and hated, and that's the reason why they left Carthagena, is because of the hostility of the whites. That isn't true either. The reason why they left is because job opportunities became more and more scarce for them, because according to a black lady that I interviewed in Anna in 1985 when she was 68. A lot of factories would not, in this time period, would not hire black people. And also their social opportunities became more and more scarce. As the younger people grew up, and as the generations moved from one generation to another, the younger black people had fewer and fewer people of their color that they could socialize with, fewer people that they could date and get married to. And so they began going to the larger towns, the black communities in larger towns. And it was just sort of an evolutionary process that gradually more and more black people just began to leave the Carthagena area. And as more and more black people left, that left fewer black people here, and they had no real reason to stay either. I mean, they had no social connections anymore, and so they began going to like Lima, Piqua, Anna, where some black people had already settled. One thing that people also don't understand is that there were two sets of blacks that are associated with Mercer County. The first arrived in the 1830s. A man named Charles Moore, a black man who was emancipated in Kentucky, came to Mercer County and bought 64 lots in what's now Carthagena and platted the town. Okay, and at the same time this was going on, a man named Augustus Wattles, who was a white man, a Quaker from Cincinnati. He taught a lot of black people in the Cincinnati area, and he became really concerned because at this point there were a lot of really ugly racial riots going on in Cincinnati, and the black people were being killed. And he thought, I need to get these people out of this town because this is a dangerous situation. And so he traveled all over Ohio looking for a spot to locate these people. He finally came to Mercer County, and although at this point Mercer County was pretty much swampland, there was an area down in what's now Carthagena that was pretty rich farmland. He bought 10,000 acres of land. He went back down to Cincinnati, brought the black people up with him, and that's where they settled. They named the town Carthagena after Carthage in Africa. Okay, that is the community that functioned through all those generations. I think, and I'm not real sure about this, but from what I can find, black people were the original settlers of Carthagena. White people came later. And that's one of the things that attracted Wattles to the area, is that it was isolated. And he thought, well, this is going to be a nice place for these people to live. They're going to be away from people, nice farmland, everything will be okay. And it was for quite a long time. He had some money from some backers of his, and they started building a school, which they later called the Inland Institute, on the land where the St. Charles Seminary is right now, a few hundred yards away from it. That school he built for, he called colored youth and Indians. Although there's never any record that any Indians ever went, it was always black youth that went there. The school, it didn't last for very long, but even after it closed, the community of Carthagena, the black people stayed in Carthagena because by then they were a thriving, functioning community. people don't seem to understand that now. They'll ask questions like, what did these people do for a living? What did the black people do for a living? They did the same thing for a living that anybody else did for a living at that time period. I mean, they were blacksmiths, they were tinsmiths, they were teachers, they were preachers, they were carpenters, they were farmers. They did the same thing that everybody else did. Okay, the second set of black people that were associated with the county were the Randolph slaves. Now, these are the ones that are spoken of most of the time. But what most people don't realize is that the Randolph slaves never actually lived in Mercer County. Okay, in the 20s, I would imagine, John Randolph in Roanoke, Virginia, who owned a plantation where several hundred slaves lived, wrote a will saying that when he died, he wanted his slaves to be free, and he was going to will them $30,000, I think it was, so that they could relocate somewhere away from the South. Okay, John Randolph was a very famous man. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. But he was also, apparently, at least his family thought he was mentally defective. And one of the reasons they thought he must be mentally defective is because he was going to will all these slaves away and give them all these thousands of dollars. Okay, before he died, he hired a man named William Leigh, L-E-I-G-H, to find some land for his slaves to live on. Okay, William Leigh did the same thing that Augustus Wattles did, just started traveling all over the place. And he finally settled on the same idea that Augustus Wattles had, which was Mercer County was the place where these people should settle. And probably part of the reason is because the Wattles community was already living here, and also it still was pretty isolated. So he bought 3,000 acres of land in Mercer County for the 300 Randolph slaves to live on. Okay, John Randolph dies, but the family is very unhappy. They contest the will, and it drags on for like 13 years. It's 13 years after he dies that the slaves finally are set free and finally are able to come to Mercer County to claim the land that's already been purchased for them. Well, the case was very well known. Newspapers at the time were writing about it every stage of the way. And so people in Ohio became aware that these slaves had been released to freedom and were on their way to Ohio, and became very upset. Okay. The Randolph slaves were coming by canal boat and by covered wagon. At the same time that they're starting out on their trip, a group was organizing itself in Celina, which ironically was led by a judge named Lindsay, to keep the black people from claiming their land here. Now this really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because there already were several hundred black people living in Carthagena with no problem. And why these people in Celina would become so upset at the idea of the Randolph slaves settling here, you know, it doesn't make any kind of common sense at all, but they did. The black people, the Randolph slaves, finally arrived in New Bremen by canal boat. At this point, New Bremen was part of Mercer County. Mercer County encompassed both Mercer and Augustus counties. The people from Celina greeted them bearing farm implements of various types, sticks, rocks, knives, guns, and they refused to let them get off the canal boats. Okay, well, this dragged on for like 3 days. There wasn't any actual violence. I mean, there were a lot of threats and a lot of nasty names exchanged, but nobody was hurt. But the black people just stayed on the canal boats for like 3 days trying to decide, what do we do? They couldn't go back to Virginia, because if they did, they would be put back into slavery. They had to stay here, but where? Okay, eventually they just went back down river and settled in the Anna and Piqua area in 2 towns named Rumley and Rossville that were that they settled and were all black. So I'm trying to connect the Carthagena community and that community. Okay, as the years went by, there became more socialization between the black people in Carthagena and the black people that settled down the Anna, Piqua areas. And it's for that reason why you find a lot of the names of black people that grew up in Carthagena are the same as the names of black people that now live in that area. Also, a lot of people from Carthagena eventually settled in Lima, and you'll find a lot of their last names are the same as the black people that grew up in Carthagena. What else do you want me to talk about? Around the early 1900s, 2 young men named Joseph Moten and York Ryle in Miami County became aware, apparently all of a sudden, that there had been this land that had been purchased for their families in Mercer County that they'd never ever been able to claim. They filed a lawsuit in Mercer County to try to reclaim the 3,000 acres that had already been purchased for them. It went to trial, which apparently was a very lengthy process. A copy of the transcript is like this big, so it had to have been a rather lengthy trial. Eventually was unsuccessful. The judge ruled against them. They appealed it to the Court of Appeals. They appealed it to the Supreme Court, and they were unsuccessful at both levels.
The shaded sections of this 1853 map show the areas owned by the black population in Carthagena.
This stone in the fenced-off section of the St. Aloysius Cemetery reads, T.R.C. Cannon, gone to rest.
Emily A. Moss died December 7, 1872. She was 12 years old. Uriah Rickman died November 18, 1893 at the age of 50 years. He served in the Civil War.
Each emancipated slave was issued a number, and their papers included these, their names, and a brief description of the person. At the bottom reads, I, Winslow Robinson, clerk of the County Court of Charlotte County, in the state of Virginia, aforesaid, do hereby certify that the foregoing registrations are true copies from the record book of registers of free Negroes and mulattoes in my office. Given under my hand in the seal of my office this 14th day of May, 1846.
William Fox was a school teacher in Carthagena.
On the grave of infant Levi Hurd reads, a loved one is gone from our circle. On earth we shall meet him no more. He has gone to his home in heaven, and all his afflictions are o'er.
The early history of Doris Bowles Venerable's family reads like a storybook. On her mother's side, the patriarch of the family was William Henry Hurd, an Englishman with curly blonde hair and blue eyes, who was born in 1785 and came to America at the age of 19 as an agent and business manager for an English company. He settled in Savannah, Georgia, serving for a time as lieutenant governor of the state, and acquired property which included a plantation on which he owned slaves. Hurd married his black housekeeper, and they had 4 children. Angry that a Georgia state law required that he hold his own children as slaves, Hurd sold out his property and headed for Ohio. William Henry Hurd died in 1855. His estate was divided among his children, a daughter, Georgiana, who married Matthew Moss, and 3 sons, William Hurd, who married Louisa Stewart, Charles Hurd, who married Mahala Jackson, and Henry Hurd, who married Amanda Rickman, all of whom eventually sold their Warren County properties and moved to Mercer County, apparently attracted, at least in part, by the good farmers, although not all became farmers. The Hurds settled around Carthagena in the 1830s.
On Venerable's father's side, the patriarch was Thomas F. Bull, who was born in 1798 in French Guinea. A violinist, he departed his homeland for New York to follow his girlfriend, but by mistake disembarked in Virginia, where he was grabbed up and put into slavery, the only member of Venerable's family to be a slave. He soon bought himself out of slavery with his violin playing, and he and his first wife, Janetta, had 13 children. He and his second wife, Margaret Taylor, who already had been married and had a family, had 1 son, Charles Watson. Charles Watson Bowles married Nancy Rickman, and they had 5 children. Jesse, Venerable's father, Hazel, who married a man named Holman, Charles Uriah, Mary, and Albert. There are many different stories and explanations about the disappearance of the black population in Carthagena, but one constant reminder always remains: the fenced-off section in the St. Alicia Cemetery. Although while they were living, Carthagena, unlike the rest of the country, was a close community. At death, they once again were segregated. Thank you for watching this presentation. I'm Tara Carr.
And I'm Julie Wenning.